Hey guys, I'm back. To talk about the sweet life. So before we go out and discuss our fact of the week, I wanted to take a quick second and discuss major similarities and differences between table sugar and honey. And maybe even answer that age-old question of, is honey healthier for you than sugar? So whenever we talk about these two things, it's important to note that they're both carbohydrate, calorie-dense sweeteners. They both are comprised of some sort of combination of glucose and fructose. The major difference, though, is how our body utilizes that by way of digestion. So whenever we have something like sucrose, plain table sugar, it's important to note that this comes from sugar cane or sugar beet generally, and that the glucose and the fructose are still bonded. We're not able to break down that bond until after we consume it and it gets to our lower intestine where it's able to break down that bond. Then we have the glucose and the fructose available to us for use. And glucose is, as we know, one of the most important energy factors that helps our cells produce, thrive, and even us thrive. The issue, though, is that since it takes so long to get broken down and have that glucose available to us, we may have an overabundance of sugar then in our bloodstream, and we could have a spike. That's where honey is different. Honey is already broken down. Generally, the bond is broken because there's an enzyme that bees will produce into the honey that breaks that bond already. So whenever we consume honey, one of the good things is that the glucose and the fructose are already broke down. That means that we already have glucose readily available to us and to our body, meaning that we can immediately start to absorb that glucose and utilize it for energy for our cells. Pretty cool. Okay, I forgot one disclaimer, and that disclaimer is that nobody under the age of 12 months should consume honey. The reason being is that they're susceptible to a condition that's called infant botulism, and this is caused by the spore from a bacterium, Clostridium botulinum. That spore is found in a lot of natural foods like honey, and specifically with honey, it's difficult to remove that spore. Now, with adults and older children, our gastrointestinal tracts are mature enough that it can ward off that toxin if it is consumed. But with anybody under the age of 12 months, if that's consumed, their gastrointestinal tract might not be mature enough to ward off that toxin, and sometimes infant botulism can be fatal. So it's important, nobody under the age of 12 months should consume honey. Now let's get to that fact. So this week's fact is all about how honey is produced. So once bees start emerging out of their hives, a field bee will come out of this hive and it will go in search of a flower. So if we were a field bee, we would come out of this hive and maybe travel to a flower like this. Like one of these. Or a flower like this. Or like this. Or flowers like this. So what's going to happen is that a field bee is going to come up to this. It's going to use its proboscis, its tongue, to drink the nectar from a flower. And a nectar is basically sugar water. So they're going to store that in its honey stomach because bees have two stomachs. They have one real stomach and they have a second stomach that is their honey stomach. This is the stomach that when they drink that nectar, they store it in there, and then that field bee flies all the way back to the hive to pass it off. So now that our field bee's honey stomach is full of nectar, they fly back to the hive and they actually find a few different house bees that they will transfer this nectar to the house bee through their proboscis. The house bee then takes that nectar in, they mix it in their mouth with different enzymes that actually breaks down that glucose-fructose bond that we talked about earlier. At this point, we have unripe honey. The house bee then deposits that nectar into a cell, and then they allow the honey to ripen. And it's only allowed to ripen through the process of evaporation. And once we have ripe honey is once it's become 1/5 water content. At this point, the bees will cover the honey with wax capping, and it's ready to eat when the bees need it or a beekeeper comes along. So that's our fact of the week. See you next week.